Well, again, happy Independence Day weekend to you. I was debating this week whether we should just pick up where we left off a couple of weeks ago on the Sermon on the Mount, or if I should just do a one-time message on Independence Day, looking at the state of our nation, especially in the midst of these very turbulent and difficult times. These are definitely the most turbulent and difficult times that I've gone through in my lifetime as a nation. I'm sure many of you are facing the same thing. But then the more I looked at Jesus' words in the Sermon on the Mount, the more I realized that these words today would be very appropriate to our current climate. And it reminded me that as followers of Jesus Christ, Christ and the Scripture are our foundation. Regardless of the times that we live in, we need to hear Jesus' timeless words for our contemporary day. What we don't need to hear is my opinions about what we are facing as a nation. So we're going to pick up in the Sermon on the Mount where we left off 2 weeks ago, Matthew chapter 5, starting at verse 21. And today we're going to look at our broken identities, our failed ideologies, and lastly, we're going to look at God's redeeming reconciliation. So, from the Gospel of Matthew chapter 5, starting at verse 21, the words of Jesus. You have heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not murder, and whoever murders will be liable to judgment. But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. Whoever insults his brother will be liable to the council, and whoever says, you fool, will be liable to the hell of fire. So if you are offering your gift at the altar, and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother, and then come and offer your gift. Come to terms quickly with your accuser while you are going with him to court, lest your accuser hand you over to the judge, and the judge to the guard, and you be put in prison. Truly I say to you, you will never get out until you have paid the last penny. And this is the word of our Lord. Let's begin by talking about our broken identities. In the last message on the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus said this. He said, I have not come to abolish the law and the prophets, but to fulfill them. And then that section is followed by this section, which there are 6 straight statements of Jesus where he begins with, you have heard that it was said, but I say. And each time he looks at an aspect of the old covenant, the old law, and he begins to push us to the heart of what that law is about. So this week he says, you've heard it said, you shall not murder, looking at the law against murder. In the next coming weeks, he'll speak about adultery and divorce, bearing false witness, justice, and love of enemies. And I think the common theme throughout this section is this. Jesus is saying something like, if you really think you have kept the law, if you really think you are moral and good, don't be so sure. You are probably not as good as you think you are. And now this message really flies in the face of current American doctrine. See, I don't think as Americans, we really believe in the doctrine of original sin any longer. I remember back in the 1990s, I heard President Bill Clinton say something like this. He said, look, I believe in my heart that all people are good. And within the week of him making this statement, I heard Rush Limbaugh say, I believe that all Americans are good in their heart. They really want to do what is right. And I had this profound thought. I thought, if Bill Clinton and Rush Limbaugh can agree on anything together, well, then it must be true. Both of them were saying, people are good in who they are. Their identities are good. Well, the only problem with this is it's not true. That we as Americans tend to believe that people are genuinely good. Now, there's a partial truth to this. And the partial truth is this. Every human being is infinitely precious. Every human person is created in the image of God. And every person has a certain goodness about them because they retain the image of God. So people who are very broken can still do good things because of the image of God placed on their heart. And they do have a certain prevenient grace, a grace of God that is working that maybe they are even unaware of. However, people are not fundamentally good. Jesus is pointing us in the Sermon on the Mount over and over again to the fact that we are truly broken. And I think Jesus starts with this commandment here. He starts with murder for a reason. I think this is the one commandment, thou shalt not murder. It is the one commandment that pretty much everybody knows, even if they are not religious in any way. And the reason why people know this is because most people, if you say, are you a good person? They will say something like, yeah, I'm a good person. I mean, I'm not perfect, but I'm good. And it's like, I've never killed anybody. I've never committed any horrific acts of violence. I'm a pretty good person. And we justify our goodness because we all know that there are worse people in our society. Like, I'm not a serial killer. I'm no Jeffrey Dahmer or Ted Bundy. I'm a good person. And it's ironic, right? We seize upon this commandment, thou shalt not murder, to be the standard by which we judge ourselves. We don't look at the other 10 commandments. Let's do that for a minute. Let's just really quickly look and see how we stack up against the other 10 commandments. The first commandment, you shall have no other gods before me. And the second, you shall not make a graven image and bow down before it. Have you worshiped anything above God? Have you in your life placed anything above God in your life? Of course you have. This is probably, the sin of idolatry is probably the essence of what sin is actually about. Now, you may say, well, I've never actually carved an image and bowed down to it. Well, I don't think that's exactly the only part that this commandment is getting at. So we'll give you, I'll give you half credit for that. You've never actually worshiped a little carved idol. Way to go. Congratulations on that. The next commandment, you've never flippantly misused the name of God. You've never taken his name in vain. Most of us have. How are you doing with keeping the Sabbath day holy? Or the Lord's Day for us as Christians. How about this one? How did you do growing up honoring your father and your mother? So we start to see really quick that we fail on all of these. And then we get to the commandment on murder and we're like, I've never actually killed anybody. Full credit for that one. Way to go. And then we come to adultery. And again, there's a lot more adulterers in our land than there are murderers. But still, a lot of people could say, yes, I've never committed adultery. We got 2 in a row, all right? We got some momentum going. Then the commandment is, do not steal. And of course, I've never stolen anything major. I've never committed felony theft. But man, I took stuff when I was a kid. And I mean, on the internet, if I ever, downloaded material that probably has copyrighted, and you start looking at this, and it's like, we've all taken. And then the next commandment is bearing false witness, lying. Well, I've never lied under oath, but how many times have I bent the truth and told lies? And then lastly, have I ever coveted my neighbor's property, my neighbor's spouse? And all of a sudden, if I'm being generous, at best, we've kept 2.5 of the 10 commandments. But we justify ourselves. We look at all the other broken people around us and say, well, I'm not as bad as they are. I'm still a pretty good person. I've never murdered anyone. And it's interesting. See, Jesus is speaking the Sermon on the Mount to people who are probably more righteous than the average people in our day. He's speaking to committed followers of the old covenant. And many of them were religiously devout. And most of them would have scored much higher than 2.5 out of 10. And yet, when we look closer at Jesus' words, he's taking us to the heart of the commandment. Let's look at this. He says, you have heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not murder, and whoever murders will be liable to judgment. And I think Matthew didn't record this. Jesus said something like, congratulations, way to go, you've never killed anybody. But Matthew didn't record that part. But Jesus says, but I say to you, everyone who is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. Now, the word judgment here is the same Greek word for court. So Jesus is saying, if you have committed murder, you will stand before the court and be judged. But I say, if you are even angry, raging at your brother, you will stand before the court and be judged. And the implication is, this is the court of God. The criminal justice system can deal with you if you have actually committed murder. But God will still judge your heart if you have murder in your heart. And then he goes on, he says this, whoever insults his brother will be liable to the council. Now this is, I always read from the English Standard Version, but the word insults is a bit of an interpretation. There are other translations where the literal language is, Jesus says, whoever says to his brother, raka. And that raka is not a Greek word. It's actually an Aramaic word. So the New Testament is written pretty much all in Greek, but there are several occasions where the Aramaic word is used because Jesus actually spoke Aramaic. So a few times the gospel writers will include an Aramaic word, and this is one of those occasions. So the Aramaic word, when Jesus says, if you say to your brother, raka, that is an Aramaic word meaning empty. And it's a transliteration into the Greek. And it's a word that really just means like this person is worthless. It is an empty person. So if you say to your brother, you are empty. In other words, it's treating another person with just utter disregard and contempt. And then he says you'll be liable to the council or the Sanhedrin. And then lastly, Jesus says, and whoever says, you fool, will be liable to the hell of fire. Whoever says to his fellow human being, you idiot. Jesus says you're liable to Gehenna is the Greek word. This is not Hades, the general place of the dead. It is Gehenna, the valley of Gehenna, the rotten garbage heap outside of Jerusalem, a place of suffering. So what Jesus is pointing us to, he's like, so what if you think you've never committed murder? I say to you that if you've murdered, you'll face criminal judgment. But if you are raging, if you treat others with hatred and contempt and completely disregard their lives, you are in the greater danger of your soul being destroyed. Do you see how this passage might be a very relevant message to our social and political world that we live in? I see so many people in our world and on social media with utter contempt and hatred for their fellow human beings, and yet they think they are good. There is such vicious and vile behavior in our culture, and yet the people who are most vicious, the people who are most vile, think that they're good. And this is their mentality. They think, the problem in this world is the system. I'm a good person. It's all those people out there that are bad. And if I ran everything, there would be justice because I'm right. And you can just see the raging blindness of their own sin. Sure, you've never murdered anyone. Congratulations. It's probably because you really don't have the power and you know you really couldn't get away with it. But what if you did have the power? What if you did have the opportunity to let your internal rage run free? What would happen? And Jesus says, the evil of your murderous heart is already destroying your heart and your soul. Jesus is pointing us to original sin, that none of us are innocent when it comes to the heart of the law. Well, secondly, let's talk about our failed ideologies. See, when we ignore our own personal sin and the original sin of humanity, we still recognize that the world is really broken and messed up. So if the problem isn't our sin and the sin of humanity, what the problem must be is, it must be structures. The problem must be the systems and structures in governments. If the problem is not us, the problem must be elsewhere. Now, I am not going to deny that there are evil governments and evil systems and evil structures in the world, because I know this, that human beings are raging and selfish and want to justify themselves, and they often create very unjust systems. But the problem is not the systems themselves, or at least that's not the fundamental problem. The problem is humanity. The problem is sin. And what we've run into in the Western world of late is that when we give up our belief in God and we give up our belief in original sin, then all we have left to blame are systems. All we have left is politics. Now, I know there are political problems and we should work for political solutions, but as a follower of Jesus Christ, I just do not believe that the political problems are the deepest problems. So we're going to talk religion and politics for a few minutes. Now, I know these are the two things that you are always supposed to avoid talking about, but let's look at religion and politics. Let's look at where these words come from. Let's look at the etymology. The word religion comes from the Old French religare. And this word means to bond together. So if you think about what religion is, it is what bonds God to humanity and humanity to God. And in what is real about the world, what is real about theology, what is purpose and eternity. This is what bonds persons to God and persons to each other within a religion. And then if you look at the etymology of politics, the word from the Greek, poly meaning many, and ticks meaning blood-sucking parasites. Just kidding. That joke, that never gets old. Actually, the word politics comes from the Latin, and it directly means citizens of the state. Politics is all about doing life together. How do we do our lives together? It's the same root. Politic and picnic come from the same root word. So if you think about a large meal, a picnic together, how do you do a meal together? How do you do life together as citizens of the state? And here's one of the problems we face in the Western world. We increasingly abandon religion, the deepest things that bond us to God and to each other. If all that is left is human relationships and there is no God and there is no ultimate purpose, if there is no eternity, then all that's left is politics and systems to save us. But Jesus is speaking the truth that is something deeper than what our political systems can save us from. He is speaking honestly about our own hatred and our own viciousness and our own contempt. And when you have people who are contemptuous and angry and vicious, you cannot take these people and create a perfect system. You can't take flawed and broken people and make them into a good and holy system. If you don't think Jesus is telling the truth in this, let me just ask you this. I want you to take your blood pressure after reading 3 posts of people who disagree with you on social media. Just read 3 people from the complete opposite side of the aisle, read what they have to say, and then, check your blood pressure. Because most of the time it's like, these people they're so stupid, they're such idiots. And we start to realize that the problem is deeper than the surface level ideology. We begin to feed our own self-righteousness. And I want to say this to all of us. I don't care what side of the aisle you are on. It is far easier to hate and to tear down and to have contempt for those on the other side than to admit our own sin, to build up, to work toward reconciliation, to grow in virtue in love. It's always easier to tear down the other side than to actually grow in goodness and grace. Let me give you an illustration of this. Let's say I gave you permission to have 24-hour video surveillance of my life. And for several weeks, you were able to watch me and you were able to see all of my failures and flaws and selfishness as a father. So I give you permission to do this, and for several weeks you could just take note of how much I fail as a father. And I will tell you what you would see. I will admit to this. You would see me several times holler at my children unnecessarily because I was tired. You would see me at times slack off and let Jill do more than her share of the work because I know I can get away with it. You would see moments of selfishness and neglect. And it would be very easy at the end of several weeks for you to write a scathing report about all of my failures and flaws. It would be easy for you to provide public evidence that I am not as good of a father as I would like many people to think that I am. It would be pretty easy to point out my failures, and I would be guilty as charged. And that would be fairly easy. Do you know what would be far harder? It'd be far harder to go out and improve your own parenting skills. It would be much easier to point at all of my flaws and say well, I'm not as bad as Tristan. And that's probably true in some case. But it's far harder to go and do the good than to be cynical. See, it is easier to tear down and be a cynic. It is a lot harder to be better yourself. And here's what I know. Ideology is always easier than reality. Let me say that again. Ideology is always easier than reality. I speak strongly for women's equality online, but I mistreat and neglect my own wife and my own daughters. I'm against poverty and social structures that hurt the poor, but I don't really rub shoulders with any outside of my middle-class suburban neighborhood. I strongly post loving political rhetoric online and how I'm a good person and anyone who disagrees with me is awful, but I really don't even know my neighbors. I mean, we live in a day of just complete naive ideological statements. And ideology is easy. We can spout off whatever ideology we want to. What is much more difficult is to live in reality. But I know this, I will equally apply this to all sides of the political aisle. Ideology without substance is empty. Ideology without action doesn't matter. When we proclaim that we are for love and justice and righteousness while showing apathy and contempt towards actual persons, our ideology is empty and our political structures will be worthless because we aren't doing the things that actually matter. Don't tell me how good you are. None of us are good in and of ourselves. We are broken and sinful, but we hide behind our ideologies. Well, I know what you're thinking. Tristan, this isn't the most uplifting Independence Day sermon. Fair enough. Let's go to the last point. We talked about our broken identities. We talked about our failed ideologies. Let's talk about where there is hope, and it is in God's redeeming reconciliation. If the problem is human sinfulness and brokenness and not the systems, the solution is God's work in the human heart. The solution begins here. Listen to Jesus' words in verse 23. He says, "So if you are offering your gift at the altar, and there you remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar. First, go and be reconciled to your brother, and then come and offer your gift." Jesus is saying that if you are entering into worship and there is a division between you and your brother or sister, go and make it right as far as it is possible within your ability. First, go and be reconciled. Don't enter into worship with God with contempt in your heart. Boy, we live in such divided times. And there is such viciousness that I see online. I'll be honest with you, I see it just as much from Christians. And it is disheartening to my soul. And some of this is probably the result of social media. It really does promote anger and division. It rewards vicious sound bites. And I think too often, when we engage in our culture, we forget that there are actual persons created in the image of God behind each one of those screens. And we treat them with utter vicious rage. We don't like their ideology and we attack them personally. I think it's totally fine to disagree. I see lots of things online that I think, oh my goodness, this is totally wrong, or this is totally foolish, this is dumb. But so many people turn from this is dumb to that person. Oh, I hate them. I hate everything they stand from. And they rage. And we live in a culture full of rage-aholics. And brothers and sisters in Jesus Christ, this has no place in the church. Not to steal my message from several weeks from now, but the sixth of these sayings that Jesus says is this: you have heard it said of old, love your neighbor, but hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. How is this possible? How are we called to love even those who have evil ideologies? Two closing thoughts. First, we begin by repenting and looking at our own sin. Before going out into the world, before looking at all the problems in the American political system, before we go out and criticize all the other people on social media, we begin by repenting and looking at our own hearts first. Am I treating others with contempt? Am I ideological in my own sense? Am I being fake? Am I loving God with my own heart? See, we begin by looking not to the world but to ourselves, and I recognize that without God I am vile. I have no hope. That I am selfish and proud and broken. Without God's grace, I am nothing. How can I stand in judgment of anyone else when I deserve judgment? Even if I think others are foolish, I need to pray for them. God, forgive me and have mercy on all that are broken. This, as followers of Jesus Christ, is our orientation to the world. We pray for repentance first, and then we approach the world in humility. And then once we have repented, secondly, we actively begin to love the broken. We actively go out and love as Christ first loved us. We do not treat others with hatred or contempt because we have been forgiven of so much. And if God can divinely forgive us and begin to reconcile us to Him, then we can begin to love and reconcile the world to ourselves and to Christ. One of my goals for the summer is to finish Fyodor Dostoevsky's book, The Brothers Karamazov. Dostoevsky's book, Crime and Punishment, is one of my all-time favorites. I've read it several times, but I've never finished The Brothers Karamazov. So I'm working my way through it again this summer. I'm trying to make it. You can hold me accountable. But one of the stories I know from this book is from the very beginning of the book, and I find it very powerful. I've read it multiple times. I've just never finished the book. But it's the story of Father Zosima. Father Zosima was a high elder at a monastery and a very holy and wise man. And he gained a reputation for his godliness and his love. And there's a scene where a number of poor peasant women that are all distraught and in need come to him. And he ministers to them. He gives them such words of comfort and wisdom and love. And you can just see the pastoral insight. Dostoevsky creates him in just such a beautiful and holy way. And as he meets and ministers to these other women, there's a woman of higher class that is there. And she's very moved and impressed by Father Zosima. She had been to him previously with her sick daughter, and the daughter is doing better now. And she's talking to Father Zosima, and yet she has a concern. She's worried, and she's concerned because she's doubting about her own faith. She is doubting if she will be saved, if there is an afterlife. And she's asking Father Zosima, how can I know with certainty that God is real and that there is an eternity? And Zosima's words are profound here. He says this, here's how you can know. By the experience of active love. Strive to love your neighbor actively. In as far as you advance in love, you will grow sure of the reality of God and the immortality of your soul. If you attain to perfect self-forgetfulness in the love of your neighbor, then you will believe without doubt, and no doubt can possibly enter your soul. This has been tried, this is certain, unquote. So Zosima says, when you give yourself actively to others, you'll begin to have assurance that God is with you, that God is real. As you stop worrying about yourself and give yourself to others, God will give you the necessary faith. And then the woman responds, and this is interesting. She says, in active love? Well, there's another question. You see, I love humanity so much that I've dreamed often about forsaking all that I have and leaving everything to become a sister of mercy, to become a nun, unquote. And Zosima sees a problem with this. He says, no. This is the stuff of love, of dreams. You're thinking about becoming a holy person and loving humanity. This is ideological. This is not what I'm talking about. This is what he says, love and dreams. And he says, I used to know a man who says that he loved humanity so much The problem was he couldn't stand to be with a human for more than about 2 hours. And he says it's ideological. You're not called to love humanity in the ideological sense. You have to love persons. Give yourself to loving individual persons. The love of humanity is not real love. And then he says this, I'm sorry that I can say nothing more consoling to you, for love in action is harsh and dreadful thing compared with love in dreams. Love in dreams is greedy for immediate action, rapidly performed in the sight of everyone else. But active love is labor and fortitude, unquote. This is what God calls us to. If you want to be whole, stop worrying about your ideology. Repent your sin. Give yourself to your neighbor in active love. This is where God meets us and God redeems us. May God bless you.